All right, so I have a little bit of an introduction to make, and I will be reading most of it. So we are pleased to welcome Anand Giridharadas. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sure I'm not.
You can't get it right. Who can get it right?
To the Authors at Google program. Anand is an author, columnist, writing about a world in transition. He's the author of India Calling, which you all see before you. And it's about returning to the India his parents left. He writes the Currents column for the New York Times and its global edition, the International Herald Tribune, and also writes for the New York Times Magazine. He's reported from India, China, Norway, Haiti, Brazil, Colombia, Nigeria, and the United States. Born in Cleveland, he was raised there and in Paris and outside of Washington, D.C., and he was educated at University of Michigan, Oxford, and Harvard. He's a former consultant for McKinsey and later reported from Bombay for the Herald Tribune and the Times for 4.5 years. He wrote about India's transformation, Bollywood, corporate takeovers, terrorism, outsourcing, poverty, and democracy. And just to add a personal note, I was in India for 2 years. Also, I'm also Indian American, born here, of Indian heritage. And I was part of a fellowship with 20 other Indian Americans. And we read Anand's New York Times columns whenever they came out, and I think felt like he was speaking as one of us. And I think that's the large part of the reason why I was excited to bring him here. And finally, he's appeared regularly on television and the radio in the United States and internationally, including on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, The Daily Show, and other forums. And he has lectured at Harvard, Stanford, the University of Michigan, Sydney Opera House, the United Nations, the Asia Society, PopTech, and Google. I'm pleased to welcome Anand.
Thank you for that introduction. An abundant introduction, overabundant. I have to say my appearance at Google, which you mentioned, does not include today. So this is the second appearance at Google. Thank you for having me. I have to start by telling you that I mean it when I say that Google completes me. Without your maps, I wouldn't have been able to get here today. Without your Gmail, I wouldn't have gotten the note inviting me to be here today. Without your calendar, I wouldn't have known it was Friday. And frankly, I sometimes use Google Instant to remind myself of the spelling of my last name. So Google is very, very important to me in a number of ways. You invited me here, I suspect, because of a book that I wrote. It's on your chairs. But today I'm not going to speak directly about that book. Instead, I'm going to speak more generally about the vocation of writing in these strange, exhilarating times of ours. I'm going to put forward some reflections, some tentative first stabs at what it is coming to mean to be a writer in this world that you at Google are working to rewire and remake. In short, I'm going to meditate aloud with you on the proper place for the writer in ever more digital times, in what feels more and more like a tweeter's world. And I raise these questions for a particular reason. The world of writing and the world of technology need each other. We'd have nothing to read on our devices without the people who bear witness to our times and string words together for a living. And those people will have no living to make if they don't figure out how to write for a world in digital upheaval. But the world of writing and the world of technology often find themselves in a kind of conflict. Our lives are increasingly defined by the assumptions, the values, the rhythms of digital life. But those assumptions, values, and rhythms are in many ways in tension with the writing life. Today I want to speak about 3 features of the universe that you here at Google are building. Each of these, I would suggest, poses a challenge to the traditional idea of what a writer is. I want to explore with you each of these tensions, and then to ask what of the writer's role should persist despite these changes, and what must adapt. So what are these 3 features of what we may call the googly world? My sister once worked here, so I know the kind of inside lingo like that. The three features I want to talk about today of your world are, among others, instantaneousness, feedback, and openness. Now, I've chosen these words almost self-consciously as corporate buzzwords. I'm sure every one of you could pull out your phone and find within the last few emails you've received some variant of each of those three words. They are, you might say, the cliches of the googly world. But what I want to suggest today is that these words, commonplace as they are, harmless as they seem, pose a challenge to our customary understanding of what a writer does and is. Let's start with instantaneousness. Not long ago, some of you might have even been a part of this, Google came up with the notion of finishing our searches for us. You called it instant. It was a very apt technology for our times, and fitting for a company that bothers to tell me that it took only 0.36 seconds to fetch me those 203 million results. A contemporary innovation was the second coming of the iPad. That machine's most celebrated improvement over the first one was that glorious new cover that removed 5.1 seconds, unbearable seconds, from the process of getting the tablet going. This is an instantaneous age, and velocity has achieved a moral status once reserved for things like fidelity and chastity. It goes far beyond Google and the iPad, of course. In an instantaneous age, our cable TV pundits must respond at once to every minor happening in American life. We must watch the Super Bowl, and instead of waiting for tomorrow's water cooler reviews of the ads, simultaneously keep our eyes on a second device full of hashtagged chatter about what is happening on the first device. Photos from a party must be uploaded now at 3 a.m. Otherwise, it's like your party never happened. Journalists no longer have the daily deadline at 5 p.m. They file throughout the day for the web, maybe once an hour. This instantaneous culture can be hard on the writer, whether the novelist or the White House reporter or the literary critic. The overwhelming pressure of this culture is to burp out the thought that you have right now, regardless of how good it is, regardless of how it relates to your other thoughts, regardless of whether it is a thought better sowed in the fields of the mind, left to take root unseen, harvested only when its time has come and it has grown into true insight. Of course, the writer can opt out, can withdraw from Facebook, withdraw from Twitter, I should say withdraw from Google+, perhaps turn on that wonderful program called Freedom, which liberates you from the connectivity that Google works so hard to spread. But such is our present culture that withdrawing can be confused with non-existence. Not to offer these easy reactions, not to lend these breezy thoughts, is almost to declare I was in my time but not of it. I learned something about this when I had the chance to interview one of my literary heroes, the writer V.S. Naipaul. I filled a notebook with questions, some about his books, some about his life, but many about the planet that we shared. I wanted to take his mind in the short time that I had with it and stretch it to apply it to these vexing questions of our age. But he loathed these big questions, these prompts for punditry and off-the-cuff analysis. I asked how his convictions had changed over the years. He answered, "That's writing my books all over again. It's too big a question." I asked how his idea of the good society had evolved. He answered, "I haven't worked it out like that." Narrowing it down a bit, I asked whether he had come to love England, where he settled after leaving Trinidad. He answered, "That's a provocative question. I wouldn't answer it." I asked about all the talk of the decline of the West. He answered, "I haven't thought of that idea." Since this Nobel laureate seemed not to have thought about any of the things I was thinking about, I asked him what ideas he had been thinking about, what questions he most wanted to answer. He answered, "I will know later. I can't tell you now, not because of secrecy, but because I have to find out." Now, V.S. Naipaul, for those of you who've read him, is a famously cantankerous man. He is a man who revels in his own cantankerousness. But something more was at work here. The more we spoke, the more I realized that Naipaul was defending a certain idea of writing that was at war with the culture of instantaneousness. Let me quote what he told me a bit later. Quote, "There are two ways of talking. One is the easy way, where you talk lightly, and the other is the considered way. The considered way is what I have put my name to. I wouldn't put my name to the easy thoughts, because you can often have outrageous views, passionate views, and that's the source of your thoughts eventually. But when they occur, they are very rough and brutal, and so a lot of writers' time is spent in working out or refining coarse thought." End quote. As I say this today, I cannot help but think of my fallen colleague Anthony Shadid, who died yesterday in Syria, one of the finest journalists of our era. As his old colleague, the columnist Mike Barnacle from Boston, put it on television this morning, and I'm paraphrasing, Anthony didn't tweet, he reported. He listened to the people in the field, and then he thought about what they said before writing it. This ethic is worth remembering in these new times. The question we must wrestle with is, how do we preserve the act of writing as the refining of coarse thought in a culture that is so voracious for our easy thoughts? Now, a second important feature of the world you're building is feedback. As much as by rapidity this new universe, the googly universe, is defined by feedback, loops and loops of it. Big data, advertisements that are continually refined minute by minute based on who is searching what, who is clicking what. A world that constantly adapts to us, responds to us, learns from the last time. For the writer, there is no seduction greater than that of feedback. Find me the writer who doesn't live to know what you think of the sentence she just written. But that same writer will invariably tell you that she has a complicated relationship with feedback. She pines for it on the one hand. On the other, she knows that her art requires removing herself from feedback for a time, to go deep and go long and go into the creative wilds, to let her mind roam free. And then, only when it's time to return to the world and be judged. With no judgment at all, her art would die. But with judgment always on, it may never reach the level of art. But feedback everywhere beckons to the writer today. From the Amazon sales rank to the most emailed list, from the Twitter count to the newsroom memos that tell the staff who is winning the page view war, the writer knows how she's doing almost as she does it. We speak of standardized tests impelling teachers to teach to the test. Well, rankings and ratings impel writers to write to the ranking. Yet it's a temptation that many writers will tell you undermines their craft. But here, too, there is no turning back the clock, nor should there be. We live now in a feedback world. The writer will have to adapt. How, though, can she seize these benefits, be part of the interactive, responsive world, without losing her craft to the creative suffocation of pandering? A third feature of our digital life is openness. How many of you would declare yourselves to be against openness? No takers. Openness is big these days, particularly here. Open source software, an open encyclopedia that anybody can read, write, and edit. Open publishing so that you can bring out your own books without a publisher. Open sourcing of the news such that CNN, which used to only report to us, now asks us to report for them. The fetish of openness even extends to the kitchens of fancy restaurants, where you can now witness how it's all done. Once again, this open source ethic is a provocation to the traditional notion of writing. In so many ways, writing has not been open at all. The writer has tended to style himself as a solitary figure, working in isolation, cut off from everything, impermeable to the world beyond and his readers. The writing industry, too, has never been open. It is hard to get an agent, harder still to get a publisher, hard to get your book reviewed and placed on the faster-moving shelves of the bookstores. Exclusivity defines the writing world. It is something special to be a writer, something not available to anyone who would try. Of course, in reality, the writer has always been less isolated than she likes to imagine, embedded in a literary tradition, financially tied to the money pots of her age, allied with and opposed to other writers. But it is this vision of the writer as a priest of words, remote, exclusive, authoritative, that is challenged by the ethic of openness that marks our age. One of the most successful writers of today, Paulo Coelho, recently spoke about his own embrace of digital values, and specifically of his addiction to Twitter, where he seems to produce almost as many words as he does through books. Here is what he said about the old way that writers were conceived of in the society and the emerging new way. Quote, "They used to see writers as wise men and women in an ivory tower, full of knowledge, and you cannot touch them. The ivory tower does not exist anymore. If the reader doesn't like something, they'll tell you. He's not or she's not someone that is isolated. Once I found this possibility to use Twitter and Facebook and my blog to connect to my readers. I'm going to use it, to connect to them and to share thoughts that I cannot use in the book. Today I have on Facebook 6 million people," end quote. He also noted in that interview that he had more Facebook followers than Madonna. What he did not mention there, but later did, was use a webcam and Twitter to allow anyone with an internet connection to watch him at his desk writing his next book, which I did and discovered to be a surprisingly boring thing to watch. My friend Barrett Tunde Thurston, a comedian and author of the new and bitingly hilarious book How to Be Black, did something even more radical. I suggested to him one day that he use a screen sharing site called join.me to reveal to his fans what his word processor screen looked like as he finished the last chapter of his book. And he's one of these guys who's up for anything, so he did it. And so as he finished that last chapter, people tuned in and watched his screen the same way he was seeing his screen. And it created amazing conversations and connections between him and his readers, connections that he never could have gotten by coming around and doing a book talk like this, which is still the traditional understanding of how to do it. And it demystified, this is the important part about the world of openness, it demystified this process of writing that is so magical to people but closed and inaccessible at the same time. It showed that you sometimes delete things and then rewrite them and then delete them again, and it shows the contingency of something that seems so polished and formal, but is not. And yet I can see this terrifying many writers, this screen sharing, including this one right here. I don't think many of us are yet ready to do what Baratunde did. Writers will perhaps resist this culture of openness for a time. But is Paulo Coelho right? Must the writer accept a fundamental shift in what is opened and what is kept closed? Must she accept that she is no longer a priest hovering above her readers, but now a pilgrim walking among them? So I've suggested to you 3 ways, among others, in which digital culture, the assumptions of the digital world, pose challenges to the writer as traditionally understood. What I don't want to imply is that the world you are building here at Google is inherently threatening to the writing life. What it threatens is the conventional, the received idea of what a writer is. But the best writing exists to overturn the received and the conventional. So we must be open to the visions and revisions of writing that new realities inspire. For a young writer like me, early in his career, there is much seemingly to be gained from this new universe and its new equations of influence and authority. My friend Anne-Marie Slaughter, a wonderful scholar at Princeton and former State Department official under Barack Obama, speaks of every profession's having to adapt to these new equations of power and influence. The leader, she says, must become a catalyst, the public relations agent, a convener, the diplomat, a connector, the reporter, a mapper and crowdsourcer, the editor, a curator. In each of these shifts, an older exclusive authority is diminished. Influence in this new way lies in catalysis, what elsewhere has been called power with others rather than power over others. And writers too must ask themselves, what does it mean now to have power with and not power over the reader? If you look at this generation of writers, not V.S. Naipaul's generation, but the generation rising up now, and even some older writers, people are finding ways to be true to the writing vocation and yet be part of this new reality. Whether it's Paulo Coelho opening up his writing process and yet knowing when to shut it off and go within, whether it's Teju Cole, the Nigerian novelist, who has taken to Twitter, but not to talk about the Super Bowl, but rather to remix and rewrite the Nigerian news headlines in a brilliant and literary and novelistic way, or Salman Rushdie getting into Twitter wars and pally banter, even as he remains wearing another hat among our most serious defenders of writing with a capital W. The question, perhaps, is this. As the writer gives in to these new possibilities, or, to put it more positively, learns to profit from and bask in them, what will be his or her special role in the instantaneous, feedback-driven, open world? Is there still a special role for those more considered thoughts, for those ideas that take time and must be unwitnessed to mature, for those things that cannot be crowdsourced? That special role is something I believe in. It's something I would urge you to believe in too. And it consists, I think, in something that is just about the opposite of the algorithms for which Google is famous. What remains vital in the writing vocation, when it is practiced most ably, is the critical consciousness, the wry voice, the ironic observation that cuts against the grain of contemporary understanding. Algorithms make us more similar. They believe in the possibility of right answers. The critical consciousness resists easy answers, indeed always seeks to complicate things. It seeks out lovely incongruities. It insists on what it sees when the crowd, however numerous, is wrong. It seeks not to answer, but to explain, not to search, but to give meaning. It seeks to turn human beings into that magical invention called characters, people even fuller in words than they seem in real life, brimming with contradiction and complexity. At its best, writing stands with legs in our own time and eyes outside of it. It questions the basic assumptions of an age that are as normal to us as waves are to the fish. To take one example, the faith so common to this time that regressions of data are the preeminent expression of truth. In a season when big data rules, writing stands for the usefulness of intuition, for the proposition that things needn't always be scatter-plottable to be true. The best writing is often the truth that people don't want to hear, not always the aggregate of each of their private understandings of the truth. Above all, perhaps, and in closing, writing is how we give one person the experience of being another, of seeing the world as another does. When it does what it ought to do, and what I hope it continues to do, writing is a blissful, fleeting reprieve from the encumbrance of knowing only ourselves. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions about this, and I know I did not talk about the book on your chairs. I'm happy to talk about India, and if you would like to do a short reading from the book as well. But go ahead.
So I guess one can think about maybe the demise of sort of the great writer or this priest of writing that you think, but on the other hand, there's sort of been this destabilizing force by breaking all these barriers, right? And anybody now could potentially be a writer, and maybe there's more spontaneity. So I'm thinking of the Arab Spring, of course, where maybe it's nobody really planned or considered or orchestrated anything. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about sort of some of the positive side of more free, open, and less controlled speech.
Absolutely, and I think in a way, there's a difference between words and writing, but one of the things that differentiates the Arab Spring from things that happened even 10 years ago that was similar is that it was, 98% of the words that were written about it were by the people there on their phones. New York Times correspondents and Washington Post correspondents account for a very small fraction of all the words generated by that crisis. Now, a lot of it was crap, and a lot of it was wrong, but that doesn't matter. You have, as you say, this extraordinary opportunity to turn everybody into a writer, to write about their little piece. What's most useful from those tweets and other forms of expression is often not their literary quality, it's just their informational value. A reporter can't be everywhere. And so the opportunity to say, this happened here and this happened here, and to look at trends and all this stuff is very useful. I think if you were to reflect, however, on how you came to understand the Arab Spring, how you came to make a different kind of judgment about it. For example, should America intervene or not, right? Would America intervening and standing up for the people help or hurt? Those kind of more complicated strategic judgments, which are very important judgments. I'm not sure if the tweets alone would have helped you make that kind of judgment. I think there's still a huge place for context, history, the weaving of those tweets into, but every time people talk like that in the last 100 years, this has happened, actually. There's all these ways in which, to kind of go back to what Naipaul was saying, our easy thoughts are not always the right thoughts. So there's a huge fluorescence in the world today of easy thoughts. So part of what you're saying, when many more people can write and these barriers breaking, it's a proliferation of easy thoughts. I think the question that I'm raising is, what does that do for hard thoughts? It doesn't necessarily destroy hard thoughts, but it creates a culture in which the premium on hard thoughts may be reduced. And I think the ability to make some of the choices, like do we intervene or not, or does Google thinking about very complex ethical choices around privacy, these are deep questions that require a deeper level of scrutiny that I think writing has traditionally stood up for, and that I hope it continues to stand up for.
I have a question. Do you see, you've had a lot of international experience and written quite a lot about it. I'm curious as to whether you see these three trends of instantaneousness, openness, and feedback. If you find that their impact has been more or less equal across the world, and if we talk about the democratization and the global nature of these kinds of trends, do you find that there are communities that are left behind? And connected to that, something else you've written a lot about, this is two questions, is the role of the United States in the future of the way we see ourselves and our role internationally. Do you see that changing because of this?
On the first point, it's totally not evenly distributed. And so that's an obvious point, which has to do with the way the internet works and the way censorship works, and it's still extremely possible, despite the rhetoric of internet openness, countries routinely opt out of entire platforms, and those companies often support that decision. So the internet is not as universal as we often think it is, but I would say that even in places where there's a high degree of what sociologists call power distance, which is kind of the sense people have that people in power, how far they are from them, not physically, but kind of psychologically. Even in places with high power distance, like India, the things that this technology does, all these elements, the ability to tweet at certain ministers who actually tweet back, is something unimaginable for a middle-class Indian. it's something that creates an opportunity that he has not had or she has not had in any way at all. There's nothing, absolutely nothing like it. You take something like being a foreign correspondent in India, which is a relatively privileged role, and how hard it is to get through the maze of phones to like get at a minister to interview them, right? Which is why everybody uses cell phone numbers, because you can't get through the official landline channels, their assistants and their deputy assistants. And then suddenly some guy in a village can tweet at Shashi Tharoor, and Shashi Tharoor tweets back. It is such an upheaval to that person in the village's traditional understanding of what power is and how it works. And yet that person goes home to there being not enough water, no electricity in the village, and totally corrupt local officials. So it's not, I think we often tend to kind of imagine that if this stuff arrives, it wipes out everything. It doesn't. But it's still extremely powerful in the intervention it makes in traditional equations of power. To your second point about America's role, I think it's one of the reasons I came back from India and still write about the world, but from a base here for a newspaper here, because I actually think this commitment to writing and bearing witness as something special, as a craft, is more respected here still and has greater institutions that defend it than anywhere else in the world. And even though these internet and technological trends are in large part originating here, it is also that older idea of writing as something worthy of protection that flourishes here. I don't know that I could do, I certainly don't think I could today do what I do, having grown up in 90% of the countries in the world. Not because of freedom or censorship, just because of the kind of atmosphere and education it takes to be able to see things critically and to see outside things and to go into people's lives. And there are very few countries that allow that kind of consciousness to form.
There are two aspects to what you presented and to what we're discussing now that are very compelling. The first aspect is the aspect of content creation, and the second is content distribution. The tool sets and facilities that we have these days, the power of the computers that we have, allows content creation to be universally shared by everyone. Everybody can use the same tools to create the content. Just as in the music industry and in desktop, the so-called desktop publishing revolution, the tools just became better and better. Now, in terms of distribution, the internet has turned out to be sort of a great equalizer there in general. So what I mean is that it used to be that music artists were at the mercy of the studios to have any chance of getting their music heard globally. That is no longer the case.
Right.
And I would argue that writers may be moving into a convergence there, whether or not the quality of their work is as good as those that did not have those advantages at an earlier stage of time.
Absolutely, and I think that's the trade-off. So I think given that the problem of writing, it's hard to imagine something more ripe for disruption, to put it one way, right? A process where, just think about it. A process where you have to know people to have an agent, and then the agent has to know people to get a publisher, and it's based on random forces, etc. That's based on all the premises of printing, right? So all the rituals, even publishing an ebook today, you need to go through all the rituals designed for the print world. But when it's not scarce, when it's effortless, basically costless to distribute, it's almost silly for any publishing company to restrict who they publish. They just publish everybody, right? But certain kinds of work, I think what you would do, very simply, if you were to switch to that world, would be to drastically improve your discovery of voices, right? So it's kind of the Moneyball thing. You'd find all these writers who, for some arbitrary reason of our judgment and our structures in the world, don't get published, and you'd publish them. Right. But I think what you also would do, I think you'd kill a lot of the kinds of writing that have also been important to the world, because you would, in a way, there's certain kinds of writing that require the judgment of a publisher to approve it, to stick with you for 3 years, to publish it, to edit it, to pull it out of you, in a time when the market would not reward you for those 3 years. And if you had to make it on your own in the market world, you wouldn't last 3 years, and then you'd quit and you'd, go work at Google or do something more sensible. You might be. So I think we'll increase, but those things go together. I think we'll find more of our J.K. Rowlings, right? But there are a lot of people who would not get that investment, because it's basically marketizing the writing world. That's basically what we're talking about, making it more open market, which means you discover more talent. But what you don't get is the kind of publisher at Knopf who sees a 26-year-old writer, sees what they can be 5 years early, develops them in a way that's totally not ever going to pay itself back, pushes them and creates a literary great. And that is a big part of the history of publishing. So that would be my concern. But I think overall, in a world, particularly a writing world that is dominated by so few voices from so few places, this is in the main an extraordinary chance to hear other voices.
So it's a two-part question and an attempt to bridge your talk with your book. So you talked about how a villager in India can now tweet with a minister and get a reply. But then that also was partly responsible for the minister losing his job because the country wasn't quite ready for that.
Absolutely.
So what do you think it will take for countries like that to get ready and embrace the fact that everyone can be open, and sort of encourage ministers to be open and not be scared of that? And taking from that, what do you feel are the key differences between, say, India and other countries and the US that you've talked about in your book?
I mean, I think in your first point, it will not be accepted for an extraordinarily long time, because it rationally should not by those other people, right? Shashi Tharoor is a different kind of minister who's suggesting a different kind of Indian power equation. And the kind of Indian power equation he believes in, which is in some ways more familiar here, where he spent the last 20 years of his life, is deeply threatening. If you are a traditional Indian minister with guys in white kurtas waking up outside your house every morning calling you sir, sir, and lines of sycophants coming to tell you how wonderful you are every morning, this is what he suggests is a totally different idea of power. Those people will absolutely reject this idea of power. When you talk about barriers being broken, it is them, those people, who are being broken. Because that villager, when he realizes that that minister is actually an ordinary guy who can respond to me, is going to start asking why other people don't. And part of this shift, and Shashi Tharoor, interestingly, is a writer as well as a politician. This is happening to writing too, and it's very, it's a bit abstract, but it's also very practical. The practical question is, while you're writing a novel, should you tweet and share little bits and ask, what do you think about that sentence, or should you not? It's a very practical question. How do you spend your day? Should you, every time you have an interesting idea, kind of get it out there and road test it? Or should you kind of hold them, let them stew, let them go through the Darwinian process within you, let the bad ones die and the good ones endure, and then share when it's the right time? These are very different choices, and they have to do at the core level with how you think about power and influence. And I think writers don't tend to think of themselves in terms of power and influence, right? But I forget the exact number, but I think they found recently, I think it may have been Google that found this, that there have been, I forget the exact number, but they found the number of books that have ever been written. And it worked out to about 1 book per 1,000 humans who've ever lived, which sounds about right. So 1 in 1,000 people who've ever lived have produced a book on average. Now, it's that kind of specialness around writing that I think is under threat, but it's probably a very good thing that it's under threat. I think like everything else in the world that's being disrupted, these things were less special than they seemed and deserve to be opened up. But you don't want to lose the core of what also made them work.
I have a question. So one of the things they've really driven home here at Google about like Google Plus versus other social networks is they've really tried to make Google Plus a place to have more educated and involved conversations, not like on Twitter or supposedly Facebook encourages something else. And I was just wondering, like, your opinion on what it would take to, because I mean, right now we have more knowledge available to our fingertips than any other time, so we should be having these conversations, but there's a lot of also distractions going on that kind of take us on other paths. So I was just wondering what you think about that, and if there is like a forum or the right place that will develop those conversations.
And I think that's a great point, and it kind of goes back to the point raised earlier, which is that I think one of the great disappointments of the democratization of information is how poorly a lot of us have used it. I think I would be slightly more excited by all this barrier breaking if its primary effect, or at least one of its primary effects, was like liberating all these new voices. I think, if you go to Reddit, the primary effect so far has been to unleash a lot of human ugliness. That's been much more of an important effect, in a way, of the last 10 years. And then there's the Arab Spring, and there are these things that happen that are different. But 95% of this unleashing of new voices is people being, at best kind of fine, and at worst mean, racist. I mean, racism now has received a second wind from the opening up of these communications that you don't realize it really hadn't had in a long time. Where were those sentiments going 15 years ago? Maybe to your family, and that's it. These are things you couldn't say at work. People now openly utter racist things in these social forums that actually they have no other place to utter in polite American society anymore. So I don't know what the answer is. And again, this is part of, we don't live in the world where Walter Cronkite brought all of us the news of President Kennedy's death at the same time, and 40 million of us watched that, or whatever it was. And the next day we could go in and say, where were you when Walter Cronkite told you that, it's not a synchronous mass culture world in that way. And that's probably for the good. But I think one very serious question is, why is our ugliness such a prominent feature of what we feel like expressing when all these new voices are allowed? And I think for you guys, the interesting technological question is, are there algorithms and kind of rules of engagement that actually influence our behavior? Is it that we've designed the internet wrong? Is it a design problem? Are we just terrible people? Or is it design choices? So one very famous design choice is anonymity, which was a choice someone made. The internet could have been, not anonymous, and it's anonymous. The choice to make it anonymous has allowed an ugliness to flourish. That, for example, on Facebook, which now pushes more and more for actual identity, and you can't even use a given name if it's not your passport name, in theory, it makes it a little bit harder. So I think that that whole debate, which you guys know about persistent identity, is one solution. Even if you say in the Arab Spring situation, it doesn't have to be your real identity, but you have to maintain a single persistent identity throughout these conversations. But I think it's a very interesting technical question to think about. Besides persistent identity or true identity, what are ways of kind of hacking these conversations to allow them to be free and open, but to bring out some of what's good in us rather than most of what's bad?
So earlier when you were speaking, you were talking about I guess several factors that are kind of driving the art of writing or the world of writing towards more spontaneous and perhaps somewhat less deep thinking and expression and that kind of thing. How likely is it, do you think, that this sort of critical style of writing will actually survive, given that there are sort of like these macroeconomic forces against it?
I mean, I think I'm never pessimistic about vocations as much as I am about industries. There's a difference between a vocation and industry. The industry could well die. But that's like saying the CD industry is dead, but music is not dead. I mean, is it a worse time for music than it was 10 years ago? Absolutely not. It's better. It's a worse time for people who make CDs, though. It may be a worse time for musicians, but it's not a worse time for music. And I think the same thing will happen for writing to an extent, that it will be a worse time possibly for writers, certainly a worse time for people who publish writing, the companies that publish it. And there will be all kinds of new opportunities. So today, a young friend of mine who's in graduate school here, we've been talking about her career, and she wants to be a journalist. And what I tell her is you should learn to do everything. So you should write, which she does very well. You should learn to write in European languages and in English, which she's partly doing. You should learn to shoot video, because the premium is less on good video. It's on video that accompanies the same person that was doing the writing, was able to do video, was able to do an audio interview, was able to live blog. I spoke to an editor at a very large American magazine yesterday who said that magazine is moving in the direction of, this magazine has very long cycles of publications, maybe a year between the time they assign a story and the story is in print. So he said throughout that year, that person can actually live blog the production of the story, the work that goes into it. They can send photos. You can tease the story for a year, and then the magazine piece becomes this like final hurrah after a year. So there's definitely ways in which this stuff will get remixed and remade to be even better than it was before. But I think the real question behind your question is, in a way, after all this sorts itself out and the companies go and change and some new forms are created, some new forms die, where will the vocation be? What will the person who wants to be a writer, who wants to kind of, as I said earlier, stand against the grain of the time, what will be their place? Will they have to work other jobs, which is not necessarily a bad thing, sometimes gives you an exposure to real life. So you could have changes like writers need for the sake of employment to be employed and write on the side, which is what a lot of 19th century writers did. You could have the idea that all publishing becomes self-publishing, which means we have a much more market-driven publishing industry, much less curation. That would be good, that would be bad. But I think the question is, where will the voices that in a way we don't want to hear but need to hear, where will they go? There's certain things that will not trend on Amazon but need to. Those are the things that I think are worth worrying about the most.
All right, so we have a gift for you, and please join me in thanking Anand for speaking with us.
Thank you all.